Last time I was with you, we started the Sermon on the Mount, and I said that sermon spans 2 chapters, or really 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7. Last time we looked at verses 1 through 10. This time we're going to look primarily at verses 11 through 16. Before we get to the text, however, let's go back and refresh our minds as to what we talked about last time. I said that verses 1 through 10 were the blessed sayings, or the Beatitudes, and they conveyed 2 major themes. First, these Beatitudes are character traits that mark the life of a true disciple. Secondly, I said that the realities of the Beatitudes also point to an eternal reality. Because the natural man, the unconverted man, the unregenerate man, who does not naturally live according to what the Beatitudes portray. It is only by the power of God working in us that enables us to live according to the Beatitudes. Therefore, the first step to discipleship is conversion. Conversion. A true disciple is one who is born again. We must be a new creation with a new heart and a renewed mind. And out of the spiritual life, this new heart and new mind, comes the living out, or the walking out of the Beatitudes listed in verses 1 through 10. But rather than looking at the Beatitudes as actions performed on our part prior to conversion, we need to look at the Beatitudes as evidence that God has brought salvation to us. But we also need to be careful with the Beatitudes. We don't want to be legalists. Because even after being raised to spiritual life, we are still sinners, in a sense, as Martin Luther says. We're both saint and sinner, and that we are declared righteous, yet we still have sin in our physical bodies, as Paul says in Romans 7. So, we should not be looking to our actions for assurance, but rather the promises of God by faith. And as we look to God in faith, our lives should be marked by a continual war between the flesh and the spirit, and continued repentance over sin. So we should not be expecting in and of ourselves a perfect obedience, and we should not be expecting in anyone else a perfect obedience. But this does not mean that there aren't some noticeable changes. Because Paul tells us we are saved unto good works. As he says in Ephesians, we are saved to perform the works that God ordained beforehand. So there should be a change. A noticeable change to others and those around us. And by the very nature of what we have become, we become one with Christ. We have a new nature. We have a new spirit living within us. And we become children of God. Our lives begin to change. Even the way we used to think or process information should change. Because our worldview has changed. We have gone from a man-centered, anti-God worldview to a Christian, God-centered worldview. And we should now be evaluating everything in our lives through a biblical lens and a Christian worldview, because we have the mind of Christ. And we are now his disciples. And this is important. We are not just disciples when we are at church. And we are not just disciples when we are around others who are church members. But rather we are to view every area of our lives through the mind of Christ, this renewed mind, and the lens of Scripture. And please pay attention to this. For a disciple to cease to think like and act like a disciple when they leave these 4 walls is to be unfaithful to one's calling in Christ. For a disciple to cease to think like and act like a disciple when they leave the church is to be unfaithful. Because Jesus says we are to be his witnesses, not just in the church, but to the ends of the earth. Outside the church as well. And we are to teach the nations to obey all that Christ has commanded. To do this, we preach the gospel of the kingdom, right? The kingdom of Christ, and all that it means to be obedient to him. And because of this message, and our calling to proclaim it and to live it, at some point we will experience what we see in verses 10 through 12. Persecution. As Christ was the suffering servant, we too will suffer, provided we live life as an uncompromising disciple. So as we start to gear our minds towards the text this morning, I believe there are two things that Jesus wants to tell us, or two truths about the Christian life that we need to keep in mind as our backdrop. First, endeavoring to live a faithful Christian life through proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and living a life that reflects our changed nature will garner hostility from the world. And we should not be surprised, right? Because this gospel is antithetical to culture. This gospel is against the minds and the idea of the fallen world. Because the gospel by nature is exclusive. It is not inclusive. It is exclusive because we say that there is one king, one Lord, and everyone and everything must submit to him. However, secular culture says man is sovereign. And man is king and Lord, not Christ. The second thing that we need to keep in mind this morning is, though the world may despise us and hate us, as we endure by the grace of God through suffering and hostility, we, being the local church, we, being the capital Church C global church, and we, as individuals, will have far-reaching and preserving impacts in the world, if indeed we are faithful to the gospel. And why is this impact necessary? Well, we have to understand that the gospel is not just about what Christ has done for us and what has then happened in us, but the gospel is also about what Christ wants to do through us, not just in the church, but in the world as a whole. By converting us, God has made Christians a part of an altogether different society. And through this society, Christ will reconcile all things to himself. King Jesus, right now, is putting all enemies under his feet. And he is doing it through the message and the lives of his people. Many in recent years, I maybe being one of them, forget that Christianity is not solely about my personal relationship with Jesus. This is the foundation. It is important. But because of this personal faith, we are then to go out and labor in God's kingdom. Because God's kingdom is not the church. God's kingdom is the kingdom. We are an institution within the kingdom. And because of this calling and the message that we have to preach, there will be hostility between us and the secular world. And these consequences take on several different forms, as we see here in verses 11 through 16. For instance, pay attention to verses 10 and 11. Jesus says that true disciples will suffer persecution in many forms. Yet the results of this persecution begin to progress from negative, in a sense, to positive outcomes. We suffer so that we are sanctified, so that we can then become salt, as Jesus says in verse 13. Then in verse 14, he says that we will be light. And finally, in verse 16, the good deeds of the disciples will lead people to praise God. The glory of God is our pinnacle, is our most important goal. We don't just glorify God in the church, we glorify God in every sphere, in every area of life. So if you remember, I said at the end of my sermon last time, in verse 10, that Jesus starts talking about persecution here, and that disciples will suffer as he did. Yet in the midst of that suffering, they would be advancing the kingdom. And at the end of that suffering and laboring is the reward of eternity. And this reality is true for us today also. So let's pick up the text in verse 11. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. The first thing I want to call your attention to is that Jesus uses the word you in verse 11 instead of they or them in verse 10. Jesus changes from the third person in verse 10 to the second person in verse 11. Things are becoming more personal. It is at this point Jesus transitions from general statements about the disciples as a group and that they will experience, and what they will experience as they live a Christian life, to then addressing the disciples as individuals. You. In other words, suffering is not only a reality for the body of Christ as a whole, as a group, but suffering is also personal. This occurs because we should be living the same Christ-centered life with the same worldview, with the same Christian thinking, not just inside the church, but also outside the church, which will naturally cause us at times to be singled out because of the principles and truths that we espouse. And Jesus tells us in verse 11 that this persecution can take on 4 different forms. Reviling. Reviling is verbally being insulted. Persecution is the threat of physical violence. So not only is there a threat of verbal assault, there's the threat of physical assault. And also slander, or when someone falsely speaks evil against you. And there's also a second difference between verse 10 and verse 11. In verse 10, Jesus says, we will suffer for righteousness' sake. In other words, the disciples and we will suffer for doing what is right in God's eyes. We will suffer for living our lives according to what God commands, according to what is righteous. And when we suffer in this way, we suffer innocently, just as Jesus did. But here in verse 11, Jesus says something a little different. Jesus says disciples are blessed if they suffer for his sake, or on his account. So what is he saying? Disciples not only suffer for living a kingdom life, but Jesus also says that they will suffer for their allegiance to the King of the kingdom. Why will we suffer for this? Well, we have to understand something. Non-religious people are actually very religious. The question is not whether people will serve a god or king, but the question is actually which king or god will they serve. God is hated because he is exclusive, not inclusive. There is one God and one king and one Lord, who is Jesus, and all must submit to him. So in verse 10, disciples suffer for living a life that conforms to the law of God, which is righteousness. But in verse 11, disciples suffer for simply believing in Jesus as Lord and proclaiming him as King of Kings. Yet in the midst of the coming persecution, or in the midst of that persecution, disciples are to rejoice and be glad, as Jesus says in verse 12. Not because suffering is fun. We talked about this last time. No, but we rejoice and are glad because of the promise at the end of verse 12. Verse 12 says, rejoice and be glad. Why? For your reward is great in heaven. Peter echoes what Jesus says in 1 Peter 4:14. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Peter is tying the reality of suffering to a much greater reality. If anyone is insulted for Christ, Peter says they have the Spirit of the glory of God. Why? Because someone who has not been bought by the blood of Jesus will not suffer for him. We will capitulate. We will buckle. We will turn tail and run. And this immediate reality points to a greater hope, the hope of glory, the hope of eternity. But in the midst of this suffering and in the present time, we must recognize that there is great work to be done now, today, in the kingdom. So Jesus says you will be persecuted if you claim me as your king. He then gives them an example of a group of people that suffered for God. Right? At the end of verse 12, he says, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The prophets of the Old Testament were God's chosen messengers. The word prophet literally means one who is called to speak The prophets were commissioned by God specifically for the purpose of being one to speak God's truth in his word. And these prophets influenced almost every institution of Israel for the better, and yet they were most often hated and killed because of the message that they preached. And this sounds a lot like the disciples of the New Testament. Just as the prophets had been given a specific message to bring to the people of Israel, the disciples of the New Testament, and likewise the church and us individually, we also have a message to bring to the nations. And we find this in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. This is the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded. So he says, go and make disciples. I have authority. Therefore, go out to the nations and make disciples. And not just make disciples, but then teach them to observe all that I have commanded. To be a disciple is to obey Christ. And if you were sitting in this room today as a believer, you are a product of this great commission that was given 2,000 years ago. As a disciple, we are to be about making disciples and teaching obedience to the nations, which is countercultural. And like the prophets and apostles, we are to engage with culture and not withdraw, which will naturally attract hostility. Being persecuted as the prophets were puts the disciple in good company. Yet, even in our suffering, God is doing something. Jesus says the results of faithfulness to the truth of God found in his word will have the desired effect that he wants on the world. As he says in verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. Those who suffer patiently and seek the will of God to be done in all situations will naturally be a blessing to the world, though they may be hated. There are two ways in which this is true. First, disciples act as salt simply through their very existence in the world. So what is salt? What is its purpose? What did people use it for? In the days before refrigeration and chemical preservation, salt was used primarily to prevent the decay of meat. Likewise, the presence of a morally strong disciple who lives with a Christian worldview and analyzes all of life through Scripture and does what God commands in each situation can help prevent the moral decay of society, because they are used as one of God's common graces. Disciples are used as deterrents for evil and as champions for moral integrity. But how does this play out? Well, I have two very simple illustrations. It can be as simple as telling a coworker that stealing from their company is wrong, that it's stealing, or that spreading gossip about a coworker is wrong, because it's gossip, according to what God says. It's really that simple. Yet it is so effective. When all disciples live in this way, true disciples help restrain the evils of society. They help control the future and evident decay of that culture, because they exhibit morality that comes from God. Disciples are salt. They preserve. They help prevent social and moral decay. However, when Christians retreat into the church and do not combat culture, things begin to decay. Just like when salt is not applied to meat, it will rot and decay. When God, the one who defines what is right, and his disciples who are to do what is right in God's eyes are removed from society, our institutions begin to assert themselves as gods and ultimately seek to define what is right according to their own definitions. And this is only natural. Why? Because what do sinners do? We sin. We suppress the knowledge of God and seek to eliminate the moral standard that condemns our consciences. And this is because unsaved individuals want to rebel against God and not submit to him. And societies that will no longer recognize the one true God and will no longer submit to his authority will begin to decay. Because ultimately God's judgment will come upon that society. And as disciples, we are to be the ones spreading salt, and that we recognize God's standard above all and live by it. And we are called to do this even when it results in persecution. Secondly, disciples are salt because they spread salt through the proclamation of the gospel and through speaking the wisdom of God into every situation. Not only are disciples salt personally, but they also have salt to spread, right? I stated above that the natural man in his natural state wants to rebel against God. It is only the one whose heart has been changed that wants to submit to God. And God does this through the proclamation of the gospel. When we preach the gospel, we spread salt. But we also have our speech that is seasoned with salt on every occasion. As Paul says in Colossians 4:6, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Yes, we spread salt through the gospel, but we also do it through everyday interactions and conversations with others. As Christians, we are to walk in wisdom, the wisdom of God. Being wise in this case is having gracious speech seasoned with salt, knowing how to answer every person. And we can do this because we have been given a new mind. We are to be wise, and our words should be seasoned with salt. Our words should have the seasoning of the truth of God. And it takes several forms, right? The gospel, encouragement, standing for truth, correction, compliments, advice, you name it. Peter also talks about this concept, except in a little bit different light. That in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is within you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience. The fact is, we honor Christ most when we give a defense or encouraging word about him to others. We must do it with gentleness and respect, yet we do not compromise truth. We do not remove salt from the conversation because of the warning that comes in verse 13. But if salt has lost its taste, Jesus says, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. So how does salt lose its taste? Daniel Doriani, in his commentary on Matthew, says this: to understand Jesus' point, we need to understand that in ancient times, salt was a piece of rock that was dug up from the ground, and it contained many impurities. Water could wash through it and dissolve the sodium chloride, thus leaving a residue that looked like a salt rock, felt like a salt rock, and it would retain its original shape, yet it lacked the flavor of salt. The same is true of the church and of us as individuals. Jesus also warns us in Mark 9:50. He tells his disciples, have salt within yourselves. Don't lose this salt. The church and the disciples in it must maintain their distinct flavor and properties, because this flavor and these properties separate us from the other fake salts. The church must be separated from the world in the sense that we do not share the same characteristics. But this does not mean that we never engage culture. We are to contend or give an apologia, a defense for the faith, and pursue truth in every aspect of life. Though we intermingle with the world, we must remain distinctly separate and uncompromised. A church and disciples that look like, talk like, and think like the world have no preserving qualities. Its distinct flavor is gone and has become saltless like the world. The more society affects the church, the less effective the church will be. And Jesus continues to expand on this illustration as he goes into verses 14 through 16. So let's focus on verse 14 first. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Light is described in many ways in the Bible. It can be used to contrast the difference between day and night, or to refer to the sun and the moon. But in this specific context, light is denoting a spiritual element and knowledge itself. If we think about darkness as it pertains to knowledge, we would say that there are those who walk in spiritual darkness. Yes, those who walk without light. They have no saving knowledge of God. And there are those who walk in the light, which is spiritual life. One of the main themes of discipleship is that we would emulate Christ in every sphere of influence that we have. And those who are united with him have the light of Christ within them. But we must understand that this light is not generated by any of us on our own, but rather the light is given from heaven, and it is an outworking of what God has done in us. Those who shine their light are only shining the light that has been given to them. As Jesus says, I am the light of the world, in John 8. He also says that he is a light for the nations, bringing salvation to every tribe and tongue, Isaiah 49:6. So those who are united with Christ are true disciples, and they have this light. But how does the light function? First, light exposes things that are hidden in darkness. Light exposes darkness and sin, as Paul says in Ephesians 5:13. Paul also says that light exposes the hidden intentions of the heart in 1 Corinthians 4:5. We know this to be true because this light of Christ has exposed our own sinfulness and continues to do so, yes? The light illuminates the conscience of society like it has illuminated our consciences, which in turn helps to expose evil intentions. Darkness, many times also, describes the kingdom of darkness, or anything under the rule of Satan, not under absolute rule, but under the influence of. And light typically refers to the kingdom of light, or the kingdom of God. So these are two competing entities, right? The darkness and the light. As Paul says in Ephesians 5:8, for at one time you were darkness, but now you are the light of the Lord. You are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good, right, and true. At one time we too were darkness. We were dead in sin, but now those who are alive in Christ are illuminated by the light of Christ. So Paul's charge is to walk as children of light, not children of darkness as we once were, but walk worthy of your calling in Christ. And walking worthy of our calling in Christ is to pursue what is right and true, as God has said it to be. And what is right and true is not just right and true for the Christian. It is right and true for unbelievers as well. If you hear nothing else today, please hear this. Disciples cannot live compromised lives outside the church and be a light for the kingdom. We cannot act as the world does when we are in the world and think we will have an impact on it. Paul says one cannot live in the light of Christ and take part in the unfruitful works of darkness. The two are completely opposed to one another. The evil deeds of darkness wish to remain hidden. As Jesus says in John chapter 3, for everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his work should be exposed. Yet God exposes such things through the light of Christ and his disciples. In this way, God brings conviction upon the consciences and exposes the deeds of darkness to call the nations to salvation, one, through the conviction of sin, repentance, and conformity to the law of God. And we should delight in this. We should delight in God conquering darkness. This is the second and last point. Secondly, light shines in such a way that it attracts things, right? A light can be a beacon. As Jesus says in verse 14, the church is a city on a hill, and it cannot be hidden. And this light shining is someone who is living out their calling as a Christian, both in the church body and as an individual. One who has received the light of life, and they are shining it for the world to see. Through virtuous behavior, by remaining pure and uncompromising, by performing acts of kindness or acts of service, and living according to truth, not lies. These all give light to those around us. But much like the scenario above, when light is removed from society, then society falls deeper and deeper into darkness. That society begins to decay. Which is the warning that Jesus gives in verse 15. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand. The light that is given by Christ is meant to illuminate not just the church, but the world. We are to live our lives shining the light that is within us in here and outside of these walls. By being uncompromised, we share that light that we have been given with those around us. And we let the light shine. And we see what the result of that is in verse 16. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that when they see your good works, they give glory to your Father in heaven. Why might they give God glory? Because they may recognize by God's grace that something is different. They may recognize that this light has obviously come from somewhere else. Somewhere altogether alien from all the other lights that I've seen in culture. And they may conclude, once again, by God's grace, that it has come from Him. And also by God's grace, they may turn to Him in faith and repentance, which altogether advances God's kingdom. I want to end with the great Puritan theologian Matthew Henry, because he summarizes these verses very well. If you were going to summarize this entire message, it would be in these words that I'm going to read. As the lights of the world, they, being disciples, are respected and stand out, and they have many eyes upon them. A city is set on a hill, cannot be hid. Some admire them, some commend them, rejoice in them, and study to imitate them. Others envy them, hate them, censure them, and study to blast them. They, being disciples, are concerned, therefore, to walk circumspectly, or to walk in a way that is aware of all situations and always seeks to do God's will. Because they are observed, they are seen as odd people to the world. And they must take heed of everything that looks sinful, because they are so much looked at. The knowledge they have, they must communicate for the good of others. To put it under a bushel, not to put it under a bushel, but to spread it. The talent must not be buried in a napkin, but traded with. The disciples of Christ must not muffle themselves up in privacy and obscurity under the false claim of neutrality, modesty, or self-preservation, but as they have received the gift, must minister the same to others. By their good living, they must be burning and shining lights. They must be evidence in their whole conversation that they are indeed followers of Christ. They must be to others instruction, direction, encouragement, and comfort. My prayer is that this church body would remain salt and light. We're about to embark on a very large discipleship-making journey in the coming months. We need to prepare ourselves here and now. I pray that we would continue to look altogether different from the culture around us, so we remain effective for the kingdom. As individuals, I pray that we would stand when others do not. That we would not be those who are constantly wavering between two opinions, but we would herald the truth of God's word and use it to inform the entirety of our lives. We must understand that God is the one who defines truth and morality. He also defines what is good and what is evil. Therefore, the message that we have is the one true message. Culture doesn't get to define those things. God does. And we must also understand that we are laborers in His vineyard, not our own vineyard, in His kingdom for His glory. And you see, Christ will build His church and His kingdom. And all the enemies of Christ will be put under his feet. And how is he going to do this? Through his church and through his disciples. The church must continue to be the pillar of truth, and we must continue to live lives that pursue the truth of God and his standard of righteousness, both in here and out there. This is our great responsibility. And yes, we may stand out, sometimes because we are loved and sometimes because we are hated. In either case, let us be faithful disciples, as salt and light in all spheres of our lives, as we co-labor in the kingdom of God. Let's pray. Father, these are challenging words this morning. Many of us, including myself, must do some soul searching, God. We must understand that our personal relationship with Christ is only the beginning of what the Christian life is. Father, embolden us by your Spirit to be shining light in the world, to be salt that proclaims the gospel of the kingdom and seasons every conversation with your wisdom. Because ultimately, apart from you, there is no truth, there is no morality, and there is no reality of any of those things. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.